Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Happy New Year and welcome back to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Every month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's anything from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. This is your faithful host, Eric Martin, creator of the Cineverse blog and moderator of the weekly Cineverse Film Discussion Group. And if you've just discovered our program, welcome. If you're a regular listener, hey, we're excited to have you back. So, if you joined us last month, you heard me announce that we will be honoring the 100th anniversary of the German Expressionism horror classic Nosferatu this month. But we've actually decided to shelve that commemoration for later this year because we had overlooked an important milestone marked in late 2021, the 20th anniversary of the release of The Fellowship of the Ring, which first hit American theaters in wide release on December 19th, 2001. So this month, we'll be celebrating that birthday in proper fashion, and we've lined up a fantastic guest to join us in the revelry. It's Brian Sibley, a British author and journalist known primarily for his work writing BBC radio dramas, like the renowned adaptations of The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia. Brian is also the author of many making-of books, including The Lord of the Rings Official Movie Guide, and he also wrote the biography Peter Jackson, A Filmmaker's Journey. Together, we'll explore why The Fellowship of the Ring is worthy of celebration all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, ways it has stood the test of time, and what we can learn from this fantasy masterwork 2 decades on. Before we take the scenic route through Middle-earth, however, let's get the proper context on this month's featured film by turning to the trusty Wikipedia machine. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring is a 2001 epic fantasy adventure film directed by Peter Jackson, based on the 1954 novel The Fellowship of the Ring, the first volume of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. The film is the first installment in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It was produced by Barry M. Osborne, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Tim Sanders, and written by Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Jackson. The film features an ensemble cast including Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Liv Tyler, Viggo Mortensen, Sean Astin, Cate Blanchett, John Rhys-Davies, Billy Boyd, Dominic Monaghan, Orlando Bloom, Christopher Lee, Hugo Weaving, Sean Bean, Ian Holm, and Andy Serkis. It was followed in 2002 by The Two Towers and in 2003 by The Return of the King. Set in Middle-earth, the story tells of the Dark Lord Sauron, who seeks the One Ring, which contains part of his soul, in order to return to power. The ring has found its way to the young hobbit Frodo Baggins. The fate of Middle-earth hangs in the balance as Frodo and 8 companions, who form the Fellowship of the Ring, begin their journey to Mount Doom in the land of Mordor, the only place where the ring can be destroyed. The Fellowship of the Ring was co-financed and distributed by American studio New Line Cinema, but filmed and edited entirely in Jackson's native New Zealand, concurrently with the other 2 parts of the trilogy. It premiered on December 10, 2001 at the Odeon Leicester Square in London and was theatrically released worldwide on December 19, 2001. The film was acclaimed by critics and fans alike, who considered it to be a landmark in filmmaking and an achievement in the fantasy film genre. It received praise for its visual effects, performances, Jackson's direction, screenplay, and faithfulness to the source material. The Fellowship of the Ring grossed $880 million worldwide in its initial release, making it the second highest grossing film of 2001 and the 5th highest grossing movie at the time of its release. Fellowship, like its successors, is widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential movies ever made. The film received numerous accolades. At the 74th Academy Awards, for example, it was nominated for 13 awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Supporting Actor for McKellen, Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, Best Film Editing, Best Original Song for May It Be, and Best Sound, ultimately winning 4 awards for Best Cinematography, Best Makeup, Best Original Score, and Best Visual Effects. In 2021, the film was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The Fellowship of the Ring ranked 50th in the American Film Institute's 2007 list of the 100 greatest American movies of all time. Today, the film holds a 92% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, earning an average critical score of 8.2 out of 10. Let's take a moment and feast our ears on the film's original theatrical trailer.
Legend tells of a ring created by an ancient evil that gave its wearer the power to enslave the world. Believed lost for centuries, it has now been found.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
This is the One Ring, forged by the Dark Lord Sauron. Sauron needs only this ring to cover all the lands of a second darkness. He's seeking it all. His thought is bent on it.
No one knows it's here, do they? Do they, Gandalf?
The weapon of the enemy is a gift. Let us use it against him.
You cannot wield it. None of us can.
The ring must be destroyed.
It was made in the fires of Mount Doom. Only there can it be unmade.
I know what I must do, but I'm afraid to do it.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
There is no other way. There's something down there.
Are you frightened?
Yes.
Not nearly frightened enough.
Okay, so there's a key moment in Fellowship of the Ring where Frodo tells Gandalf he wishes the ring had never been found or come to him. Likewise, if Fellowship remains a yet-to-be-watched film for you, you're going to wish you had screened it before proceeding with this episode. That's because Brian and I will be traveling through spoiler land ahead, and we certainly don't want to ruin the surprises in store for you. So do us a solid, hit pause right now, and go see what all the Fellowship fuss was about. All right, everybody ready? Let's begin the journey. Let's say hello to Brian Sibley, an English writer and journalist famous for authoring countless hours of radio drama, including famous BBC adaptations of The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia. He's also written several making-of books, including The Lord of the Rings Official Movie Guide, and similar works for the Harry Potter series and the Hobbit trilogies. With his knowledge of and passion for the Tolkien universe, I knew Brian would be the ideal guest for this month's episode, and I'm so thrilled he said yes to my request. Brian, welcome to Cineversary and our celebration of the 20th birthday of the Fellowship of the Ring film.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's a delight and a pleasure to be with you.
Feeling is mutual, sir. I have to tell you, Brian, that thanks to your excellent work along with co-writer Michael Bakewell, the BBC Lord of the Rings radio series, well, it remains my all-time favorite radio dramatization.
That's really kind.
Believe me, I'm just a worshiper of that series. And in fact, I'm including vintage radio dramas in that assessment of mine, calling this my favorite radio series. Because, Brian, I'm a huge fan of old-time radio.
Me too.
You know, shows like Suspense, Jack Benny, Inner Sanctum, Lights Out, things like that. And I've probably listened to your Lord of the Rings adaptation more than 20 times over the years. And it continues to entrance me with, its writing, the voice acting, the sound effects. You think about the music, just the overall entertainment value. It's so, so good. Okay, so how did you get involved in writing both, that radio series and later the Lord of the Rings official movie guide that was published 20 years ago. There's another anniversary. So what can you share about those experiences, and how did they help you better appreciate the whole Middle-earth mythology as well as Tolkien's talents?
Well, they are linked, Eric, those two events, because I was a huge fan of Tolkien's books. I read The Hobbit when I was quite a young child. I was at school, but I found it very difficult. I'm a very slow reader still now. I was a late reader, and I struggle particularly with big, thick books. Back then, to me, a huge paperback representing those 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings was quite a challenge for me. And I found it very difficult to get into it. And in truth, I only really finally read it when I was confined to hospital with a duodenal ulcer. And I had a month in hospital bed rest. And I took the book with me. I thought, I am actually going to get into this book. And of course, once I was like 2-3 chapters in, it was unputdownable. And I was 21 at the time, and I remember asking my parents to bring me in a torch so that I could read under the bedclothes at night, after lights out in the hospital.
Sure.
So I had this very strong affection for all his books. And at one point I wrote a letter to Tolkien, and I wanted, by this time I had all the books in hardback, but I thought it was going to cost me a lot of money to send the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings and ask him to sign them. I should have done anyway, but I didn't. So I chose Tom Bombadil, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which of course is quite a slim volume of poems, and wrote him a fan letter. Quite embarrassed to think, actually, that I remember writing bits of it in Elvish, which I obviously copied out of the book.
So you're old school, yeah.
I don't know whether I expected an answer or not. You do when you're a young person. You write to people, you assume that they will write back. So I guess I probably did. I did get the book back with a letter from his secretary saying that he had signed it for me, which he had done.
Oh, very nice.
On the title page, and had also corrected a typo that was in the text. I started writing work for the BBC, mostly features, documentary type things. But I did a dramatization of a book by James Thurber called The Wonderful O. You mentioned Jack Benny, and I'm a great lover of American radio, and I love Charlie McCarthy, and I love Fred Allen, and the Benny shows are some of my favorites, and I love all the dramas.
Yes.
I think one of my favorites is Sorry, Wrong Number, which is an absolutely pyrotechnic performance, largely of one person in the form of Agnes Moorehead. And so I had a great passion for radio, and I grew up listening to radio. And in those days, there was a lot of radio for young people on the BBC, not now, but there was then. So I listened to lots of radio plays and adult plays. And I loved The Wonderful O, which is one of Thurber's kind of rather crazy parables. And I sent it to the BBC, and they accepted the script, which was great. And Mrs. Thurber approved the version I wrote. And it got broadcast, but it was 45 minutes. So it was, it wasn't that long. But back in those days, the BBC was very, almost in a way, indulgent to anybody who wrote. They had a very kind of parental attitude towards their writers. And so I had a letter which was sort of rather charmingly saying, if there's anything else you'd like to dramatize, do let us know. So I suggested a whole raft of books that I'd quite like to do on radio. Some turned out had already been done. Others they didn't think were suitable. Really, as a kind of desperate last resort, I said, but of course the book I'd really like to do is The Lord of the Rings. And I was walking down a corridor, and this guy who was in charge of what was called the script unit, a man called Richard Imerson, happened to come out of his office, saw me, and pulled me into his office, shut the door, and whispered in a really conspiratorial kind of way, "How did you know about the ring?"
Good timing is everything, right?
Well, absolutely. I had no idea. He didn't believe me at first. He absolutely believed that there was a mole in the BBC who had told me, but they were negotiating to get the rights to do a radio version. I had only dramatized one 45-minute play, and here we were talking about 26 half-hour episodes, half a year of broadcasting.
Wow, that's incredible.
The plan was, they took a very wise decision of joining me up, linking me up with Michael Bakewell, and we each of us wrote 13 of the episodes each. Michael was about the most established person I could possibly have worked alongside, although we wrote our own episodes independently of each other, because he had been a producer, a writer, a director, and he had dramatized War and Peace for the BBC some years before. So he absolutely knew what he was doing. But for me, it was an enormous kickstart to my career. It gave me the opportunity to do other things. Peter Jackson, as a young man, had the cassette versions of the radio serial. And so he knew that and listened to it. And indeed, when they cast the film, anybody who hadn't actually read the book were given a set in order to give them the bones of the story without having to read the book, which was they could absorb it in just 13 hours. So it was very fortuitous. And when I'd done some work with HarperCollins, who were the publisher tied into the film merchandising or the publishing side of it, and I had done some books with John Howe, the Tolkien artist, of maps of Middle-earth. So when the opportunity came that they asked me if I was interested in doing some books on the making of the films, and I said yes, that of course my name was known to Peter Jackson and he was happy with that. So it was extremely fortuitous, really. It was suddenly decided that Peter wanted to write a biography or wanted a biography written. And I was commissioned to do that. So I never got to write a third book about the Return of the King because I was up to my eyes in writing a book called Peter Jackson, A Filmmaker's Journey. It is itself a fascinating story of how Peter Jackson ended up making, such a hugely expensive and wildly ambitious project in the way that he did.
Right. What a fantastic journey you've laid out there for us. But yeah, we should get right into the matter at hand, which is celebrating the 20th anniversary of the first movie in the trilogy, Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah.
Now, we are going to talk about the trilogy as a whole. I mean, this will bleed into a bit of Two Towers and Return of the King as far as the films. But the proper celebration is the first film. It is my favorite of the three. It's always been my favorite book of the trilogy. I know that Lord of the Rings has been published as one complete volume, as well as 3 separate chapters. But yeah, it's always been my favorite part of the story, so to speak. But I want to ask you, when and where did you first see the film, The Fellowship of the Ring, Brian? And why is this movie important to you in any way?
Okay, well, my first glimpse of it, I had been approved as being somebody who would be writing one of the books about the series, and myself and Jane Johnson writing as Jude Fisher, who wrote another series of books called the Visual Guides to Middle-earth. Jane and I went with David Braun, who was one of the publishers at HarperCollins, to a screening room in London to see, really, I think, I try to remember just how long it would have been, probably no more than maybe 12, 15 minutes, something like that, of footage. And I think we both went with some trepidation. This was sometime in 2020. It was like top secret. I mean, we had to give, I'm joking, but we had to give kind of DNA samples and fingerprints and everything.
Yeah, submit your firstborn, the whole thing.
Absolutely. Signed away the world on an NDA. And Jane and I came out, and I think we were both absolutely stunned, but we were both so swept up and caught up in it, in thinking this is going to work. It was just instinctive. We both went, this is going to be wonderful. When did I see the film in its entirety? Well, the premiere in London, but in 2021. But in May of 2021, New Line Cinema showed 26 minutes of the film at the Cannes Film Festival, the 115th Cannes Film Festival.
Were you there?
I was there. I was in the Olympia Theatre, which 9 years earlier had been where Peter Jackson had premiered Brain Dead, and you couldn't really think about a more different project than that. And
again, I understand the reservation. He's been tasked to, adapt possibly the greatest work of the 20th century, and what is the outcome going to be? There are going to be some trepidations.
Absolutely. On this occasion, New Line took, I think, the most extraordinary but absolutely inspired decision to preview the film at the festival. Well, I mean, I remember one commentator wrote that The Lord of the Rings was the best movie at Cannes that isn't in competition, because there was only 26 minutes of it.
Yeah, it's not even a movie. It's more like a short.
But
Yeah,
it was treated as though it was a premiere. You know, all the global media were there in that theater. I have been in many film screenings of movies for the press. And most press people, the moment the end titles start running up and out of their seats and gone. But this film, I have never been at a screening where people who are normally rather, hard-bitten media hacks actually give. It was a whooping, cheering, stomping, applauding audience.
Isn't that great when that happens? It's just, it's infectious. It just takes over the room. It's great.
Well, it does. I remember Bob Shea of New Line remembering how he had gone down to New Zealand for the first time. He was about to risk $300 million, and of course it ended up more than that in the end, on whether this filmmaker could deliver what he was supposed to deliver. And he said to himself, this is bloody crazy. And I think people did think that in a way.
Sure they did.
But when he introduced the film at Cannes, I think by that time, or the trailer for it really, when he introduced that, I think by that time he had little doubt. And I remember him saying that we were the first audience to see the compilation. Well, then it comes to the premiere itself, which I think pretty much everybody who was there was blown away by it. And particularly, like you, I feel a great affection for the Fellowship of the Ring. That's not to say that I don't like and enjoy the other two films, but there's something particularly special about the first film. And I think it is because what it captures something very special that's in the Tolkien original, which is when Tolkien was writing it, up until around when the Fellowship sets out from Rivendell, almost up to that point, he was still finding his way with the story. And, it's why, for example, both Peter Jackson in the films and myself in the radio version left Tom Bombadil and all that section out of the film and out of the radio version, because it's kind of like a kind of sidetrack, it's not got the same drama as the main thrust of the story, but of course Tolkien was finding his way through it. There's a letter that he wrote to his son Christopher when Christopher was in the army in the Second World War, and he wrote to Christopher to say something along the lines of, Frodo and the other hobbits have arrived at the Prancing Pony, and they've met Strider, although I think he was called Trotter at that point. They've met this character, and I don't know who he is. And that is so honest and so
amazing. Yeah, right.
Tells you so much about how Tolkien wrote. So there's something about the early part of the book which has its own kind of evolution, and Peter captured that in a very real way. And of course, what he gave you was very early on this sense of just the beauty and the tranquility and the loveliness of the Shire. What it was that these characters would be ready to sacrifice their lives for was for this thing which was so precious to them. And it enabled him to establish Gandalf and Frodo and Bilbo, of course, and Sam Gamgee, and then the other two hobbits. And then when you get to Rivendell, you've got this glorious passage where all these characters start filling in the back history of the ring and their respective races and so on. And so that whole part of the work, which just sits so strongly, I think, as a piece of writing, just fell into place so literally and perfectly as film.
Totally agree. Yeah, I mean, a huge fan of the books for so long, the radio series, we've talked about this. But I caught Fellowship just a few days after it first hit theaters. So what was that, late December, I want to say, 2001. And Brian, to me, it felt like a quasi-religious experience. And that's because the Lord of the Rings books were my favorite books of all time growing up. I'm not alone there. In 1999, I was reading that Amazon.com readers, Amazon was very different back then, but the readers of that site, purchasers at that site, they selected the 3-volume work as the best book of the millennium. So it had already come with high plaudits. But again, my building anticipation for this movie, it was so thoroughly rewarded sitting in that theater, watching it for the first time. I was weaned on Middle-earth first by, I guess you could say, the Ralph Bakshi animated version of the story from 1978.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that was followed by a watch of there was a Return of the King TV cartoon movie in 1980. I don't know if that had made it to the UK, but I think it was a Rankin Bass cartoon movie. And then there were umpteen listens to the top-notch BBC radio adaptation, which, of course, you played such a huge part in. So in 2001, to see Tolkien's work so thoroughly and uniquely realized in a live-action feature film that, did justice to the original text absolutely bowled me over. And I remember having the thought that, this is the new Star Wars. This is the new benchmark against which fantasy and adventure films will be measured. I immediately recognized Fellowship for the immense technical achievement that it was, and appreciated how Peter Jackson and his team were able to condense this sprawling main tale so effectively, make it so, cinematically exciting, because to transform it cinematically, that's a huge challenge, right? And I had built up many pictures in my mind of what Frodo and Aragorn and Gollum and many of these characters should look like. So admittedly, Brian, it took a couple of sits with Fellowship for me to accept some of the faces, some of the voices, and the designs. But what an immense grand slam slugged out of the park by Peter Jackson and his team, creating this thoroughly entertaining live-action film from what was previously deemed an unfilmable text, right?
Absolutely.
Our podcast's anniversary recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of another film from 2001, Mulholland Drive. And I stated in that episode that was my favorite film of the last 2 decades. Well, upon further reflection, I need to clarify that statement. Mulholland Drive, in my opinion, is the greatest film so far of the 21st century. But my personal favorite film has to be Fellowship of the Ring. It never fails to completely enthrall me, to seize my imagination. The visuals are heart-stirring. The cinematic storytelling is masterful. The acting is leagues better than your typical mega blockbuster genre film. I adore all 3 movies, particularly Return of the King, but my pick for the finest of the trilogy is this first installment, for the reasons we were talking about and more. So absolutely simpatico with you there.
I think one of the things was that the film set down a very particular benchmark, which was in the look of the film.
Yes.
And I've always said that one of the strokes of genius of Peter Jackson was the way in which he brought together around him people who shared his passion for the story. And the fact that Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, who wrote the script with him, they had themselves had a passion for the book. But also the fact that Jackson brought in to the fold, as it were, everybody who could be of the most possible help to him. He brought in John Howe and Alan Lee, who were already established in the world of Tolkien as being 2 of the finest visualizers of Tolkien's world.
That's right.
And their imprint and stamped on that film is huge, of course, in the
no question
inspirational stage of the film. And then the fact that Richard Taylor and his amazing cohorts then made that visually 3-dimensionally real, actually brought John and Alan's drawings into a reality is fantastic and fascinating. The fact that they really embrace the fans as well. I mean, I remember watching the Ringer, the OneRing.net spies out trying to get their images, climbing over walls and barbed wire and between boarded up panels to try and find out what was going on. And the most original, initially, of course, the security people were all over it. And then Jackson absolutely saw that this was why alienate these people by forcing them to be spies? Why not bring them in and share with them? Because what they will do through their huge enthusiasm is spread the word. They will
That's right.
Your disciples, your apostles.
Spread the gospel.
Evangelize for you. And they did. And that embracing those people from the OneRing.net and all the other enthusiasts and getting them in and giving them the best story and the best pictures and the best opportunities. That as a piece of free marketing and publicity was a stroke of genius, but it also brought people online. So there was a huge sense, to my mind, of a great deal of people being committed to this project even before they ever saw it.
Yes. And this is no small point, Brian. I mean, you hit on it. Why is this not just the Fellowship, but the entire trilogy? Why is it so successful? Why did it turn out with such quality? The passion, the commitment, the history, the experience of these Tolkien zealots, these Middle-earth enthusiasts who Jackson brought aboard. And, it speaks to why he entrusted you, for example, because he knew.
It was, I think, two things. One, treating those zealots, as you call them, treating them seriously, embracing their passion, and absolutely not mocking them.
Right.
Obviously, the film touched many other people who weren't in that category. And that's one of its great strengths, of course, too, that it did take the book to a huge number of people who had never read it, had been put off by it or thought it was quirky or not for them.
No question.
It made it mainstream in a way that it hadn't been previously. And that's not to be undersold either.
Let's get into this, Brian. Why is the Fellowship of the Ring film, why is it worth celebrating 20 years later? Why does it still matter? How has it stood the test of time?
On every single level, really. I think the extraordinary use of scenery, the locations in New Zealand, we shouldn't forget a huge part in the success of this film, because for a country which was at the time probably less known of all the countries around because it's farthest away to the average tourist, suddenly people saw extraordinary vistas and landscapes which were beautiful and terrifying and extraordinary and outlandish, in a way that they'd never conceived. And look, they look just like what we thought Middle Earth would look like.
Incredible, yes.
I think the fact that Peter had amongst his team people with different talents. There's a guy called Jamie Selkirk, who was one of the partners in Weta Workshop, and who was the editor on the first films. He was a hugely experienced editor. I would hazard to say that Peter wasn't at that point. So he had around him people with great strengths. He had in Barry Osborne and Mark Odesky of New Line Cinema, people who provided two huge things: encouragement, enthusiasm, but also at the same time were able to put on the brake for when Pete got a bit excessive or a bit out of control. They were able to maneuver him back into line again.
That's important.
So he had, all these kind of support networks, and particularly Weta Workshop. And it was an extraordinary group of people who just put together these amazing visualizations in a way that, rivaled some of the most elaborate and memorable stuff that's been made in the Hollywood studios. This was up there with them, and particularly I'd say the miniature models, those things they created, the weaponry, the helmets, the swords, all of that stuff, which was done not just done lovingly and with great care, but also with great beauty, and bringing in again hugely talented craftspeople who could do it. People who were sword makers, people who were bow makers, all of those people. But the talent that was brought in was extraordinary. Glass makers, people who made carpets, people who created special china and pottery for Bag End, or more refined glassware for Rivendell. All of those talents, the cumulative sum of that, much of which is almost just on the margins of your peripheral vision when you're watching the film, are what make this film such an extraordinary gem.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could riff on that. Yeah, I believe it's worth celebrating because even though special effects have significantly improved over the last 20 years, we can agree, and despite the fact that we've been bombarded as viewers with a glut of films of the fantastical kind over that span, the Fellowship of the Ring and, of course, the movie trilogy as a whole, it stands as the piece de resistance, the magnum opus in this fantasy adventure subgenre, if I were to kind of categorize this as a subgenre of fantasy adventure. I hold firm, Brian, that it's better than any other fantasy adventure film released in the 21st century, and that includes any of the new Star Wars episodes, any of the Harry Potter pictures, any of those DC or Marvel movies, any of the Narnia features, or for that matter, Hobbit adaptations. Fans and critics, they can debate which of the Three Rings films is best, of course, but for my money, I'll take Fellowship to rule them all, so to speak. I'd even go so far as to say that the Rings trilogy, Brian, is the greatest film trilogy of any genre. So hear me out here. I know this sounds hubristic, but Of the first three Star Wars movies, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, the first two are masterpieces. The third, it's a little problematic to me. The three Godfather films, the first two films are unimpeachable masterworks. The third installment has some weaker moments. You think of, let's say, the Man with No Name Dollars trilogy with Clint Eastwood. One chapter is a masterpiece. The other two are very, very good. Richard Linklater's Before trilogy. I don't know if you've seen his films, Before Sunrise, Before Midnight, Before Sunset. Marvelous achievement in intimate filmmaking, filled with wonderful surprises. But the scope, the stakes involved were much smaller by comparison. Now, mind you, I said greatest film trilogy, which means a 3-film series that doesn't have fewer or more chapters. That doesn't necessarily mean I believe that Rings is the greatest series or greatest franchise ever, because there's a lot of possible contenders for that crown. But again, if you're just judging on a trilogy of 3 films, self-contained, it's the best in my opinion. And it stood the test of time because Fellowship doesn't look like a soulless tentpole production designed to pad the pocketbooks and portfolios of its creators and its bankrollers. The extreme attention to detail and respect for the epic nature of this story, which you laid out, is clearly evident in every frame. Cases in point. It's amazing to think that the production team, I was reading some of the facts about it, right, consisted of over 2,400 people. You had 26,000 extras participating in the trilogy. More than, 40 seamstresses fashioning 19,000 costumes for the 3 movies. You hear that the principal actors were engaged in weeks-long training for things like sword fighting, horseback riding, boating, even training on Tolkien speak, how to speak, Elvish or whatever. Minas Tirith was the biggest set ever built in the Southern Hemisphere. The facts go on and on. It's incredible. And you could tell that Jackson and his collaborators went to extreme lengths to build this world. They relied heavily on old school effects and techniques wherever possible. But they did, of course, use CGI as one of the many tools in their arsenal, alongside tricks like, you mentioned, bigatures, miniatures, forced perspective, matte paintings. So old school and new school. So many fantasy films today, Brian, they're preoccupied with perfect visuals that heavily accentuate snazzy but overblown computer graphics, right? And discerning viewers, they can quickly grow tired of that thing, numb to it after a while. I don't know if you've had that experience, but I certainly have. And the Fellowship of the Ring never forgets that its most valuable components are the characters and the conflicts motivating them. The filmmakers are to be commended for prioritizing personalities and story over eye candy, although they don't shirk their duties in that department either. This is a very visually impressive movie, of course. The movie is replete with show-stopping creatures, awe-inspiring battle sequences. You've got jaw-dropping visuals that require plenty of digital tools to come to life. And while a few examples of the CG may appear, let's say, a little dated, a little creaky 20 years later, the vast majority, I think, hold up very well and fail to break the spell of suspended disbelief cast on the audience. So kudos to the filmmakers there as well. And lastly, I just want to say this. Fellowship, it also matters because the acting is a cut above what you'd probably expect from a fantastical film featuring, let's face it, wizards, elves, dwarves, trolls, goblin-like creatures, other figures that some contingent of the audience may not take seriously because of the trappings involved with this, domain of geekdom, if you will, the Dungeons and Dragons types who are, kind of relegated by other types of society as, that's all just, geekdom stuff. The characters are well cast, all the more impressive considering that most of these actors were unknown or at least underappreciated at the time, so that's no small point. And remember that this film announced the arrival of actors and thespians we cherish more dearly today. You think of Ian McKellen, Viggo Mortensen, Elijah Wood, Cate Blanchett, Orlando Bloom, on and on and on. Even smaller players like Andy Serkis, nobody knew his name before this movie. So what a stroke of brilliance just in the casting alone.
Absolutely. And of course, I should add that the reason Ian Holm got to play Bilbo Baggins was because he had played Frodo in the radio version.
Of course,
20
yes.
years earlier. And of course, Peter's obsession to bring in all those people he admired, people like Christopher Lee and Brad Dourif and so on. I think there's one element which your catalogue of what you just said stands as being absolutely the truth. But I think there's an added element to it, which sets it apart from other trilogies or series of films, which is the fact that, of course, this book was never, ever intended to be a trilogy. This book was a book, a one-volume book. And Tolkien himself was extremely upset by the fact that the publishers insisted on carving it up into 3 chunks. But it was published post-war when paper was at a premium and was difficult to get hold of. And so they said, no, we can only do it in chunks. And indeed, the decision to name the second volume, The Two Towers, was one of many things that Tolkien agonized over. But so I think there was a sense that when you get to the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, as indeed you did, I remember vividly watching the Ralph Bakshi film when it first came out. And at the end of it, when probably John Houseman's voice or somebody's came in and said, this is only the end of the first part of the Ring. And I thought, oh my God, there's more to come. Well, unfortunately, there wasn't, because what we got was and I grew up watching those old Rankin Bass animated Christmas pictures movies, which were fine. But what we got with the Return of the King was not a patch on what Bakshi had achieved, actually. But so I think it's because it's one whole creative entity that it's got its own motor driving it through, and although of course it had to have its own climax, each of the episodes, there is absolutely a sense that not we may write another story or give you another story from this place, but actually this is just the first part of this story. And the other thing for me that I found fascinating was the fact that I, and I'm sure other people too, were able to accept some of the changes and alterations that were made because they felt in the right kind of a moment. When Frodo is wounded on Weathertop, and he's been cut by a Mogul sword, so he is in great danger and he's failing fast, and they're rushing to get to the ford of Iceland and get to Rivendell. In that moment, in the book, of course,
it's Glorfindel, isn't it?
Glorfindel who comes to rescue. And here they made it into Arwen, which, when I first heard that, I thought, what? But then suddenly it made sense on lots of levels, because Arwen in the book is a very shadowy figure, a figure that we don't really know or understand or have this, a real understanding of in any sense. And I remember when I was doing the dramatization, I was aghast when I thought, well, where does she speak first? And it's somewhere towards the Return of the King, end of the Return of the King. That's right. She doesn't actually speak in Rivendell when they first arrived there. So to make her such a key character early on, I think was fantastic. I had reservations about a few other things. I think the bedroom scene with Aragorn and Arwen was probably just a moment too far for me, but it was there and it was gone, so we move on.
Well, we're Tolkien purists, and we admire the purity of the original text, of course, so there's going to be some disconnects, some reservations. Always. But again, just to think about, if you are tasked with adapting this for the big screen, you are going to have to make some serious compromises, not only for brevity and length and things of that nature, but you have to condense some characters. You have to eliminate others. You know, Tom Bombadil's going to have to go. Arwen's going to have to get beefed up. You need a stronger female contingent in this story and so forth. So I understand those things and I forgive them. It's not a problem for me at all. And that speaks to some really good decisions from the filmmakers. Like there wasn't anything in any of the 3 films that just stopped me dead in the tracks. I said, no, I cannot accept this. Really nothing. It's just small, minor things that, I thought about a little bit and let them go, because really, how do you envision this for, cinematic purposes? It's very, very challenging. And the more I see Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King, the more I watch the trilogy, the more I am just bowled over by how well they did in this particular task.
I agree. I think there are a few moments where Pete's very quirky sense of humor, which we should have known was there from Brain Dead, Bad Taste, and so on, just get the upper hand.
Sure.
And it shows in the dialogue with some lines like, Gimli to Legolas, put an arrow in his gob on the walls of Helm's Deep. There are dialogue moments where you go, oh,
yeah, nobody tosses a dwarf, things like that. Right, absolutely. It's important to have a little levity in there. You can't have everything be ponderous.
With the other problem, which in fact Tolkien is low on laughs, actually.
That's true.
Very, very low on laughs.
Right.
And you needed, some byplay. So I know why it was there, but there were moments where there were little lacks of subtlety, which Tolkien would have certainly been horrified by.
Right. Now, it's interesting to think if Tolkien had lived longer and there had been negotiations for a big screen adaptation, what he would have allowed. It's a rhetorical question. We don't have time to get into it. But again, maybe we're fortunate in the sense that, the author was removed from his work by this point, and, we were able to see someone else's vision of that.
And to be fair, he himself, when he talked about the creation of Middle-earth, he talked about it in terms in his writing on fairy stories. He talked about this idea of creating something to which other people then bring their arts and their talents to and carry on creating, like the Arthurian legend. I mean, he saw this as being his kind of new mythology for England. And he was keenly aware, of course, that the mythology of Arthur, it is not just what you have in the early versions, but it's also what's accrued to it through every other version, every illustrator who's tackled it, from Mallory through to T.H. White and beyond.
Sure.
And so I think he understood that when you create something, and he did understand it because he had such a brilliant grasp of mythology and legend, that no legend is ever static. They all grow and develop and retold and rebranded and
that's important,
reborn into a new shape. And I think he would have, if he'd have been able to, I think he would have come to realize that was what was happening. And of course,
yeah, you hope so.
My response to anybody who doesn't like it is to say, well, the book's still there. The films haven't taken the book away.
That's right.
If you're upset by something in the Jackson's Lord of the Rings, well, just go back and read the book again instead. It hasn't expunged the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So we really need to get into this next question here because it's at the heart of what we are exploring in this episode. We always talk about influences, inspirations, things like that. So if you bear with me, I'm going to lay out kind of some points here, and then I want to hear your take on it. But I'm going to ask you, in what ways was this film influential on cinema and popular culture? And boy, it's a big answer here because there's many answers possible. And you think about the Lord of the Rings trilogy, including Fellowship, how it made audiences more accepting of live-action fantasy films featuring magic and wizards and mythological creatures like elves, trolls, and dragons, which were previously not taken as seriously by critics and moviegoers alike. You think about prior to Fellowship, except for a handful of fantasy-adjacent pictures like, maybe The Wizard of Oz is in that category, Star Wars movies, a few examples here and there, fantasy was a genre that didn't get as much attention or respect as, say, sci-fi or superhero films. But in the wake of the Rings trilogy, we saw plenty of imitators and close cousins. Game of Thrones comes to mind, Wheel of Time, Shadow and Bone, Clash of the Titans, those movies, Wrath of the Titans, The Golden Compass, the Percy Jackson films, Beowulf, King Arthur, the list goes on and on and on. And today, The Fellowship of the Ring, it ranks as the fourth most popular film ever on IMDb based on IMDb rating. It's also very highly rated on Rotten Tomatoes and so forth. And it's in the second edition of the AFI Top 100 films list. I think it comes in at number 50. It's the only of the three films that ranks in the AFI list. And you remember too, Brian, that this trilogy proved that fantasy films could capture the attention of cinema elites. Fellowship all by itself, it earned 13 Academy Award nominations, which at that time was a record for a genre film, winning for Best Cinematography, Original Score, Makeup, and Visual Effects, right? Among all the awards across the world for which it was nominated, the trilogy received 475 awards, I read, out of 800 nominations, earning The Lord of the Rings the title of the most awarded film series in movie history. So if you count worldwide awards, it's the tops. Fellowship scores, in fact, a 92% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which I referenced a moment ago. And it was also officially included in the National Film Registry only 2 decades after its theatrical debut. So they kind of fast-tracked it to the National Film Registry. And we could certainly talk about how Fellowship raised the bar in the visual effects department. Weta Digital, responsible for the CGI, they created what was called MASSIVE, and I guess that stands for Multiple Agent Simulation System in Virtual Environment. This was a cutting-edge computer animation and artificial intelligence software employed in Fellowship and the subsequent 2 movies. And what did it do? Well, it created crowd-related visual imagery, making sequences like the Second Age War against Sauron and the Battle of Helm's Deep possible and realistic. So that was no small feat there. You think about how Weta also famously used special motion capture technology to bring characters like Gollum to life. Now, that was more in the second movie because we just get a hint of Gollum in Fellowship. But still, the creation of that character and the possibilities of motion capture were so on display there. And those digital tools have since been used in plenty of big-name flicks, from Jackson's 2005 King Kong to 300 to WALL-E to the Avengers Endgame, etc. And you touched on this earlier, the way that the trilogy was authorized by New Line Cinema. What did it do? Well, it demonstrated that committing to several movies in a series at the same time was the right decision. In other words, they didn't wait to greenlight The Two Towers until after The Fellowship of the Ring proved to be a big box office hit, right? They gave Jackson the go-ahead to film all 3 movies at the same time, which hadn't really been done in Hollywood up to that point. This is one of the greatest gambles and highest risks ever taken by a studio, and it paid off because it certainly could have sunk New Line. And nowadays, studios are more eager to follow suit on approving multi-film projects and bestowing them with budgets in the hundreds of millions, whether it be Disney or Amazon Studios. The Fellowship filmmakers, Brian, they also weren't afraid to end with an unresolved conclusion as opposed to, a self-contained story with an upbeat denouement. The success of Fellowship showed that if you make a quality fantasy adventure movie and you get the audience fully vested in the story and the characters, they're going to come back in droves for successive chapters. In this trilogy, particularly Fellowship, it also made extended editions cool, right? Even though they expanded an already elongated runtime. The Fellowship of the Ring extended edition clocks in, I was reading at 208 minutes versus 178 minutes for the theatrical version. But me, like most fans, prefer the longer cut. It's more Tolkien, it's more Middle-earth, it's great. And likewise, the home video releases of Fellowship and the trilogy. They set the standard for box sets, offering up to, 26 hours of extra footage and bonus features in the 3-movie package. I remember getting my hands on that, tearing off the shrink wrap and zealously, inserting it in the DVD player and just couldn't wait to consume all that extra content. It was amazing. And you think about all the extended cuts and loaded box sets we've seen over the past 20 years. I know physical media is going away. They still put them out. But yeah, this is thanks in large part to the Rings films and that trend they set with extended editions and deluxe box sets.
Absolutely, and all those extras, and God knows I appeared in quite a lot of them, and those I didn't appear in, I was quite often the person who was unseen asking the questions, certainly of all the British actors. I think that's absolutely true. I think the way I look at it, everything you've said, you've summed it up, but what I would add, I think, is the Fellowship of the Ring and the subsequent 2 films were an adultification of the fantasy film. I think of fantasy films prior to that as falling into various kind of genres. The fantasy island type films, the great, and I'm a huge admirer of Ray Harryhausen, as of course was Peter Jackson. Yes. The Ray Harryhausen films or the Disney fantasy films, much of which seemed to be necessarily aimed at let's say not just a children's audience, but a children and parents audience. What Jackson did, and the whole package, everybody involved, from New Line down to the person who made the smallest pot or pan that appeared on set. And what they did was treat the whole thing as though it was an absolutely adult film. There was no sense that this was a movie for the tinies. And I know of a lot of people who went thinking, oh my God, this is a kid's movie, and came out stunned and absolutely won over to the fact that this was a fantasy film. We're not talking about a labyrinth or a dark crystal or a time bandit. You know, we're talking about something which has all those fantastical fantasy elements in it, but are not, but are clearly of a more mature stature, a stature which doesn't compromise, which doesn't pull its punches, which is not aiming at the lowest possible common denominator. Well, that's unfair, but not aiming at the lowest possible age group that you could be wanting to appeal to. And I think that decision, plus, as you say, Peter's own totally obsessive, I must keep everything. You know, I mean, I've been watching, I've only got through the first 9 hours of it. No, I'm exaggerating, but the first 2.5 hours or whatever it is, the Beatles trilogy, which he's made from the Get Back footage. This is a man who relishes everything being in depth. I mean, it's part of his real passion. I mean, I remember when I first went into his production offices and walked up the stairs, and, you know, there are posters on the stairs, but we're not talking about, you know, reprint posters. We're talking about an original poster of King Kong, an original poster of Frankenstein. This is a man who came with this enormous back history of appreciation and fandom, both a filmic understanding, I mean, an understanding of what the great beauty of film is, you know, what makes the photography in Frankenstein or Citizen Kane so astonishing, and also the fantastical elements of the storytelling. And he had those and held those in a kind of in a balance, which is what's so remarkable. And his devotion to the idea that everything is worth preserving, in a way, it also chimes actually with the whole of the Tolkien enthusiasm. You know, there are fans of Tolkien who don't content themselves with reading the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings. They want to read the Silmarillion, the unfinished tales, and all those 12 volumes of Middle-earth history that Christopher Tolkien, the professor's son, put together following his death, because they like, you know, the Jackson extras and bonus discs. They want to be part of everything. They want to know everything about how it was made and the depth of it and the things that they didn't know, the filling in the blanks. He captured, I think, a mood, and there are plenty of other films about whom, as you know, cineasts feel as passionate that we want to know all about, you know, how a film was made. I mean, they're not alone in that sense, but I think in a sense they have made way for, or encourage people to say, well, let's have all the stuff that we can find about, you know, King Kong. You know, and it's why somebody can compose an ending for Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. It's why somebody can write a new suite for the Holst Planet Suite, because there was a planet which wasn't there when he wrote it.
Right.
You know, we want to have the complete thing. Those desires within us for completion and fulfillment of something about which we feel passionate is something which Jackson made okay and grown up and not a kid's thing. You know, you're not being a nerdy fan that you just want to know all the ins and outs. It's something that is actually about understanding the creativity of something that's been created that you love and you care about. So, you know, he's done that and all the other things which you outlined, which without any question at all. And can I just say a word for Howard Shore, because Howard Shore's music, he's not the person you would have reached out to necessarily to have written.
Yeah, you think of maybe a John Williams or someone like
John
that.
Williams,
right?
John Barry, you know, those kind of people. But he went to somebody who treated what he created as something which itself was totally authentic and amazing. I mean, I attended several of his recording sessions. You know, he would choose instruments that were not necessarily the normal instruments that are being used. He did all his own orchestrations, but his music, you know, is now, to my mind, ranks. But I place his score alongside Max Steiner, or the Korngold, or the great Hollywood composers of
Bernard Herrmann and so forth. Sure.
But with his own unique musical take on it,
Yes.
his ability to be able to move from the rustic rural tones of the Shire through to the huge themes that he created for the battles and the confrontations and so on. It is a masterly score, there's no question. He shared this vision and he brought to it his own individuality. And maybe that's the secret of these films, that what Jackson harnessed through his own passion and enthusiasm and dynamism was these individual, disparate passions of people.
Yes.
Where, actors or craftspeople or for cameramen, and made them into something which is greater than the sum of the parts.
No, it speaks to his brilliance, which was his ability to pick the right collaborators and to delegate the responsibilities appropriately, and to have faith in some people who, like you mentioned, Howard Shore might not have been the first choice for, let's say, another filmmaker choosing to adapt.
And to the studio for allowing him to do that, because many Hollywood studios, and the history of movies is littered with them. Many Hollywood studios would have interposed themselves in this process and said no to this or no to that, but they were able to give Jackson the leeway and the trust. And I'm sure because they saw that it was being delivered, but even so, it was still for them. They wrote a very dangerous creature, as it were, but they knew that he was going to tame it, and that they could just ride along, and it would work. And God's sake,
well put.
It worked and works still.
Absolutely. No question about it. We always ask about themes, messages, or morals explored in the given movie for the month. So briefly, let me kick this off with just a few thoughts, and then I want to hear what you have to say about possible themes here. I'll just kind of synthesize a few common threads here. The corrupting nature of power, the fallibility and vulnerability of mortals. You could kind of point to that as a major theme. The potency of the ring, how it infects and it taints, it undermines everyone who comes in contact with it, even a humble and altruistic soul like Frodo. Time and again, we're shown how men, women, wizards, elves, dwarves, hobbits alike, they're all tempted by the allure of this seemingly insignificant trinket. So this is a huge point I think Tolkien is making here, as is Jackson. And even the smallest person can change the course of history, as Galadriel says, is another key point. The fact that a diminutive, relatively powerless figure like Frodo can bear the ring for so long without completely succumbing to its persuasion, it underscores a meaningful moral. Selflessness, courage, willingness to sacrifice, empathy, these are among the most incorruptible virtues and mighty traits that an individual can possess regardless of their physical stature. It is these qualities that made the rest of the Fellowship appoint and trust in Frodo as the leader of their quest and their ultimate hope for salvation from Sauron, right? They know that Frodo doesn't seek glory, rulership, or revenge. It's his humility, his decency, his compassion, and the fact that the enemy would underestimate Frodo that make this hobbit the best candidate for this impossible job. And one more theme I targeted here, which is another quote from the film. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given us, which is spoken by Gandalf. So how do you parse that passage? Well, to me, these words remind us that life and our times in it are precious, and each of us can make a difference in this world depending on the actions we choose to take, which can be for good or evil. Frodo wishes the ring had never come to him and none of this had happened, but then Gandalf suggests that Frodo was meant to have the ring due to factors beyond his control. But what is in Frodo's control is what he chooses to do with this responsibility.
Yeah, and we have to remember that on the very brink of the crack of doom, that even Frodo at that point weakens.
And if it weren't for Gollum, the mission wasn't accomplished, right?
Indeed. And now that I have come here, I do not choose to do what I have come to do. And that I see this as being actually, in the broadest possible sense, a spiritual story, a religious work. And that may sound a bit extreme, but we have to remember that Tolkien was a devout Catholic. Mm-hmm. It is about all those things that you said, and primarily, I think, it's about power and the abuse of power, but it's also about sacrifice. And there are lots of sacrifices made in the course of that story. Boromir, who is a failed hero, for example, at the moment, but he nevertheless fights the orcs and handles them to the point. Well, does two things. First of all, he calls the Fellowship, so the Fellowship, by the call of his horn, they know that there is something has gone wrong. But also, he fights off the orcs, enabling Frodo to escape. The sacrifice that Frodo makes of choosing to leave the Fellowship, the sacrifice that Sam makes of deciding to follow Frodo, even though Frodo doesn't want to draw his friend into it. There are so many sacrifices that are made throughout that story. Some of them more pronounced in the book than they are in the film, perhaps. Letting go of her deep-seated love of Aragorn that Eowyn has. It is about all kinds of sacrifices, some of them monumental. I mean, the whole thing is about a monumental balance between good and evil, and how, the small, as you say, can somehow tip the great and change fortune. But it's also about the intimate sacrifices that people choose to make. For example, Arwen relinquishing her option to leave Middle-earth and go to the Undying Lands because of her love for Aragorn. All of those things are bedded into this story, which make it so much more than what it appears to be. And if it's not allegory, then it is at least suffuse with all of that kind of imagery that we are aware of, from not just from Judeo-Christian beliefs, but also from much older mythologies too. The king that dies and is reborn. These are concepts that go deep into our storytelling, our worldwide storytelling heritage, and they have their own version in every culture. And Tolkien locked into them in a way which wasn't ponderous and wasn't portentous and wasn't heavy-handed, but unlocked these really strong ideas that you meet simplistically in a fairy tale, perhaps, or you meet more dramatically in the legend of Beowulf. These are things that are deeply set within our human nature over centuries and centuries, and this story, with its comparatively modern take on the kind of individuals and their characteristics, makes it something which we can all respond to.
Terrific point, Brian. This is a 20th birthday celebration. Birthdays are all about presents, except it's the fans who continue to get the gifts, I contend. So, Brian, what is the Fellowship of the Ring's greatest gift to viewers?
Oh, for me, the real gift is the fact that they brought to life and gave a physical, material presence to something which was, for many, many of us, just a concept in a book. It lived in our head and in our mind's eye, because that's what books do. That is where they live. But they were fleshed out and embodied in a way that we could actually relate to them through a different medium. And everybody who tackles a great book, whatever that book is, whether it's the Potter books or it's a work of Dickens, thinking of one of the most filmed writers in the world, whatever person approaches it, something falls short or fails or doesn't quite deliver, because you're always conscious of watching something which is somebody's perception. I just seen a brilliant production of filmic production of Macbeth, and it's absolutely stunning, but it's one person's view of Macbeth, and somebody else, any play of Hamlet, any play of Shakespeare's, Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet, whether it's Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet or it's West Side Story, either as it's originally filmed or as it's now being filmed by Spielberg, they're all telling a famous story in their own way.
Yes. The
magic of what Jackson films, and particularly I think The Fellowship of the Ring, gave us as a gift was visualizing it and presenting it to us and sharing it with us anew, because freshly in the form of film, but doing so in a way that we immediately believed that was how it was. This was our Middle Earth. And I mean, that's what I think I felt from the very first footage I ever saw of the film before it was ever finished, was this is the Middle Earth I know, and I believe in this Middle Earth just as I believed it when I read it on the page. And that is, I think, a really rare gift. I think, that there are movie makers who've delivered and done that, no question. But to do it with the scope and the style and the sweep of creativity that Jackson and his colleagues manage is, I think, unique.
So well put. I appreciate your thoughts on that. I believe the Fellowship of the Ring's greatest gift, Brian, is that it helped make the fantasy adventure subgenre respectable and legitimate. We were talking about this earlier.
True, absolutely.
So I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and this was a time when, these types of movies were relatively popular among my young demographic, but they weren't widely accepted by the masses or made with lasting quality, let's say. As an adolescent, I enjoyed the Conan movies. Dragon Slayer was a particular favorite at the time. The Sword and the Sorcerer, Heavy Metal, Clash of the Titans, Krull, Legend, and other similar fare. But I knew that most adults downgraded and dismissed this stuff. I was aware that many of these were, I guess you'd call them empty calorie entertainments without cinematic sustenance, which has kind of proven true. A lot of them just aren't works of lasting quality, let's say. These films lack the necessary budget, the believable special effects, the impressive cast, the effective filmmaking talents in many examples, and the marketing push, perhaps, to appeal beyond the teenage and the comic book crowd. But Fellowship and its follow-up chapters completely reset this template for fantasy adventure and forever changed the paradigm by raising the bar quite high. I think back to Star Wars: A New Hope in 1977. Unlike that particular moment, there was a lot more clutter and competition to break through in 2001, an era when CGI was already widely accepted, and film franchises like Star Wars, Jurassic Park, X-Men, Harry Potter, they dominated or they were coming into their own. There was no guarantee that Fellowship would become a game changer just because of all the publicized hype and anticipation. The kind of picture, that would sell a lot of tickets, please the critics, and be fondly remembered. There were no guarantees. But of all those series, and many that came after, including the Pirates of the Caribbean films, the Rings trilogy today stands as a collective work of consistent excellence, in which each of its chapters is consistently first-rate throughout. The filmmakers, they don't slack off in The Two Towers. They don't deliver a subpar outing. Nor, for that matter, is any sequence, storyline, or subplot in Fellowship a letdown. So it's a joy to revisit this movie every few years, and the adventure is always enthralling, the tension is ever palpable, the epic scale and vision is unfailingly breathtaking. Fellowship is and always will be my fantasy fave. So what are you currently working on that listeners should check out? Anything of note, Brian? Is there a book in the works, for example?
There is a book in the works, which I can't talk about, but maybe another time. What I can mention is that there's a book being published this June. It's called The Great Tales Never End, Essays in Memory of Christopher Tolkien. And this is a book which was intended as a book as a gift to Christopher Tolkien by the people who were invited to contribute to it. But when Christopher died in 2020, obviously that all had to change. And so the book is now called The Great Tales Never End, Essays in Memory of Christopher Tolkien. Tom Shippey, John Garth, Hammond and Scull, a number of well-known critics and commentators writing, and Priscilla Tolkien with a very personal view of her brother. It's, I think, going to be a really interesting collection of essays. I have a chapter in there. It's called Down from the Door Where It Began, and it is about portals in Middle-earth, in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It is a fact that doors and portals and passageways and entrances figure hugely in the books. Christopher Tolkien, I think, is an amazing person in his own right, because he was always working towards furthering his father's work. He was never, many editors given the opportunity of having a lot of manuscripts that haven't been published before would be, showy off about it. But he always put his father center in the work. And the 12 years, 13 years or whatever it was that he spent creating the amazing 12-volume history of Middle Earth was an extraordinary achievement. And
colossal.
This book plays a small tribute to him.
That's so fitting.
Lovely to be part of it, which is a great honor. But I'm just finally going to say that with all the things you were saying about, what it is that sets it apart, and I would just add one thing to it. It's certainly one of them is gravitas, that this story has in its scope and in its intention, as Tolkien wrote it, that this is a story of great import. And it's hard for people who've never read it to understand how the characters which, you could make fun of, like a wizard or a little small character called a hobbit, and a thing like a small gold ring that's been forged sometime in the past. But what he gives it is the gravitas of all myth and lore and legend. And that's why it has this totally lasting quality, which amazingly, but brilliantly, Jackson and his filmmakers captured and embodied on film. And I think that it is always more than the story. When people read it, and I know lots of people who do read it over and over again, and there are people who watch, as we know, the films over and over again, and I get emails from people who listen to the radio version over and over again. And the reason people do that is because they want to be in this world that is so totally real. For all its fancifulness or fantasticness, it's real because it's about real people, whether they're dwarves or wizards or hobbits. They are real people who experience the sorrow, the joy, the pain, the suffering, the ambition, all of those qualities that we know we experience, or other people we know experience, and they experience them in a world where we as readers and watchers of the film explore those deep set emotions in a visual world, in the case of the films, that we can comfortably and safely explore what those feelings really mean, what those powers and pressures represent to us, and still come out of it safe and secure, and maybe a little bit changed for the better.
So true, and so eloquently articulated by you. I'm so glad you crystallized this thought here at the very end, because it's at the heart of what it really means to enjoy the Middle-earth mythology, the Lord of the Rings books, and the films, and the Fellowship of the Ring in particular, which we are celebrating this month, the 20th anniversary. So it was such a pleasure to talk to you, Brian. You were the perfect guest for this installment, and I'm just thrilled that you said yes. Thank you again so much for appearing on Cineversary.
It's been an absolute pleasure and a joy. I've loved talking with you, Eric, and it's been great. Thank you.
Wow. Just wow. So great to talk Tolkien and Jaw Jackson with an expert fully immersed in this world of myth and movie making. I am indebted to Brian Sibley for being so generous with his time and expertise in agreeing to be our co-pilot this month. Thank you, Brian. Time now for standing ovations. This is where we give a shout out to a film, TV show, website, podcast, book, or other work that we think would be of interest to classic film lovers just like you. For January, I want to call attention to a brand new Netflix series I discovered called Voir, which consists of brief video essays explaining how a particular movie or film trend has impacted the lives of the writers of these essays, who also personally narrate each episode. So the kickoff installment covers the summer of 1975 and how Jaws made a memorable impact upon narrator Sasha Stone, at the time a teenage girl struggling to cope in an abusive household. Other essays cover the controversial film Lady Vengeance and how narrator Tony Zhao came to rethink the topic of revenge and vigilantism in cinema. Lawrence of Arabia and the concept of an unlikely protagonist is examined by narrator Drew McWeeny. Interracial politics and buddy films go under the microscope in Walter Chaw's essay on 48 Hours. There's a video essay about how beauty in animated films has been represented over the ages, and the final episode explores the distinct differences between movies and TV programs and how the latter has caught up to the former in quality in the 21st century. This is a series well worth your time, one that inspires you to think outside the box and ruminate on different films and entertainment trends in ways you never thought of before. It's really, really well done, and executive produced by David Fincher and David Pryor. Give it a go and see what you think. As a quick standing ovations addendum, I wanted to briefly pay tribute to the recent passing of two artists in the movie medium who we will miss: the groundbreaking actor Sidney Poitier and the filmmaker Peter Bogdanovich. Sidney's crucial importance in cinema history as a barrier-breaking and supremely talented black actor cannot be overstated, and Peter's work as a director, author, and film scholar was exemplary, particularly his passion for advancing the discourse of film discussion and interviewing all-time legends like Orson Welles, John Ford, and Howard Hawks. 2 years ago, we had asked Peter to appear on Cineversary, and he said yes, but unfortunately he was contractually obligated at that time to only appear on TCM's podcast, so he had to back out. I wish we had the opportunity to talk with him back then, but it just wasn't meant to be. Sidney and Peter, rest in peace and know that your legacies in film history are assured. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. Looking ahead to February, we're going to head back to 1942 to commemorate the genius of director Ernst Lubitsch and comedian Jack Benny as we honor the 80th birthday of one of the great comedies of the classic Hollywood era, To Be or Not to Be. Make your plans to join us next month. Until then, as ever, this is your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies because, as I say in every installment, they're not getting older, they're getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.